We are going to be looking at the NFC North, ranking every single position, see how these four teams stack up against each other, and what team has the best roster in the NFC North. Let's go ahead and dive right into it here. Starting off at the quarterback position. Quarterback was probably the toughest of really any of these positions to rank. There's just so much uncertainty. Jordan Love hasn't really started at all for the Packers. Justin Fields, we really haven't seen what he can be now that he finally has some talent around him. Will he take that next step? Kirk Cousins, Jared Goff, very much, just kind of high floor, low ceiling kind of players. I am going to go with the Minnesota Vikings having the best quarterback in the division at this point in time. Kirk Cousins is not great when it comes to clutch performances. He's not great on a consistent basis, but I will say that right now I do think he is the best quarterback in the division. He's done a very solid job over the years. This might be his last year as the quarterback of the Vikings. Overall, I do think he is a top 15 to 12 quarterback in the NFL, and I do think that while he does have some really bad games over the course of the entire season, he puts up some pretty good numbers and is a fairly good quarterback for the Vikings. At number 2, I am going to go with the Lions. Jared Goff really had a great reclamation year last year, did a very good job and was very productive. I think he did a good job kind of changing the narrative with him. He is a limited quarterback, but I think overall he did a very good job last year and deserves that number 2 spot. Number 3, Justin Fields. He has all of the ability in the world and absolutely could be number 1 on this list, and it might not even be particularly close at the end of this year. But he hasn't shown enough as a passer at this point. He's one of the most dynamic athletes at the position. I do think that his legs do give him a relatively decent floor. He's finally got somewhat decent offensive line. They added Darnell Wright, some other players there. You also have a wide receiver 1 in DJ Moore. We'll talk about some of those guys more later, but I do think that Justin Fields has to show it. He has all the ability to finish 1 on this list, but just needs to show that he can get there. Jordan Love, I do think, is insanely talented as well. Right now, I don't think you can put him anywhere besides 4th just because he hasn't shown really much of anything at all, really hasn't shown that he can or can't do it, but he's a complete unknown at this point. And for that reason, he's going to be number 4, but I do think that this could potentially be completely the opposite at the end of this season. But, this is a very difficult position to rank in the NFC North. Let me know who you would have as your quarterback 1. Moving to running back, I think it's going to be the Packers. Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon. They've got a really good 1-2 duo there at running back, and I really like what they can do. Aaron Jones is more of the pass catching, outside of the tackles type of runner, while A.J. Dillon is just a bowling ball. He has gigantic legs and can just absolutely run through everybody. So I think that, you've got 2 deep in the Packers running back room, both very talented, both very good. They're going to be at number 1. The Lions are going to be number 2. I think Jahmyr Gibbs is going to add a really interesting element to that room there. David Montgomery came over from Chicago. He's going to be on the roster as well. I do think he'll be a contributor. They move on from DeAndre Swift. I do think they will have very high expectations for what Gibbs can be. Montgomery will probably be the first and second down back, at least to start the season. But another nice 1-2 duo. Probably not as good as the Packers, but I like the upside of what Gibbs could potentially bring there. At number 3, going to go with the Bears. I do think that they've got some nice depth at this position. You drafted Roschon Johnson. I do think he'll be the starter at some point. Khalil Herbert was a very good running back too last year. He outperformed David Montgomery in a lot of metrics. So I think that, if they all kind of reach their potential, they've also got Donta Foreman there, who was very productive for the Panthers after Christian McCaffrey got traded. I do think they could move up this list. They've got some good players there, but I'm just not sure that they have a dominant running back 1 at this point. I think they've got a lot of really quality depth and some really nice players, but they just don't have that true dominant force. And then number 4, it's going to be the Vikings. They move on from Dalvin Cook. He's a free agent at this point. Alexander Mattison has looked good when Dalvin Cook's been injured, but I just don't think he's a true difference maker. I don't love the depth behind him as well. So I do think that they are pretty solidly at the running back 4 spot at this point in the NFC North. At wide receiver, I am going to go with the Vikings number 1, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, KJ Osborne. That's a pretty good wide receiver room. Justin Jefferson, the best wide receiver in the league, in my opinion, so he absolutely boosts this rating up a little bit, but I really, really like, Jordan Addison is a nice wide receiver too. I wasn't the highest on him coming into the draft, but he landed in a perfect situation. KJ Osborne's a solid number 3 as well. Then I think we go to the Chicago Bears, who have completely rebuilt their receiving core at this point. DJ Moore, they got in the trade moving back from number 1. He is a true dominant number 1 wide receiver. He's very, very productive, and that's something that Justin Fields desperately needed to really kind of unlock his potential there. You've also got Darnell Mooney, who is coming off an injury, but I think he's proven to be a solid number 2 receiver. And then you can do worse than Chase Claypool at wide receiver 3. I'm not sure he is at all worth the trade that they made for him, but I do think that he does have some flashes, and as a third option, I do think that he can be a decent player for them. Next, we've got the Lions at number 3. Amon-Ra St. Brown is just an absolute chain mover. He's potentially the best slot receiver in the NFL at this point. I definitely think that he's proven to be a top 15 receiver, somebody that's very underrated. Just people don't put a lot of value in slot receivers, but he is just so consistently good at creating separation, being a reliable target on third down, and I think Jared Goff benefited a lot from having him on the team. Beyond them, they do have Jameson Williams. He is suspended for the first couple of games of the season. Behind him, they don't have a ton. Marvin Jones and some other guys there. Don't love the depth in the Lions wide receiver room, but I do think that overall, third in the division makes sense for them. And then finally, we've got the Packers. They've struggled with this position ever since Devontae Adams has left. I think Christian Watson is a really good player. I think he has a great chance to really break out and be a number 1 wide receiver, but they just don't have a lot of proven weapons and proven commodities in that wide receiver room. Romeo Doubs, you drafted Jalen Reed out of Michigan State. I like some of these guys, but I just don't think that they can be rated any higher than number 4 here. Just not much proven at all in that room. Moving on to tight end, this is also going to be the Vikings at number 1. TJ Hawkinson. Obviously, they got him from the Lions, but he was incredibly productive last year, was a Pro Bowler, and really was their second option in that passing offense for the Vikings. He really kind of turned it on, and I think the Vikings really value him. He is a good player, and definitely somebody that I really like for them at that tight end 1 position. At number 2, I am going to go with the Bears. Cole Kmet is a good blocker. He showed some stuff in the receiving game last year. He's very good after the catch. They also bring in Robert Tonyan from the Packers. There's kind of some tight end swaps here in the NFC North, but I think they've got some good depth now at that tight end position. And Cole Kmet, Robert Tonyan, you can do a lot worse than those two at number 1 and number 2. For the Packers up next, I am going to put them at number 3. I really like Tucker Kraft and Luke Musgrave, who they drafted this year. I was actually higher on Kraft. I think he's great after the catch. He is a very solid blocker as well. Musgrave is more of that athletic, vertical stretch tight ends. I think they actually complement each other very well, but there's just not much proven at all, once again, in this receiving core for the Packers. I do think that the inexperience is going to hurt them potentially, and tight ends do tend to take a couple of years to really reach their potential, but I do like both of the guys that they drafted, and I think they deserve this number 3 spot. And then at number 4 for the tight end position, it's going to be the Lions. You've got Brock Wright, Sam Laporta, who you just drafted in the second round. I just don't think there's a ton there. Laporta obviously is going to be somebody they hope can really kind of take over those reins and be a good player. I actually liked Musgrave and Kraft more than him, so I wasn't a huge fan of that pick. Overall, I do think he's got some good yak ability and definitely can be a piece for them. I just do think it will take some time for him to really kind of settle into that offense. Brock Wright is absolutely not somebody I get super excited about, so I am going to put the Packers 3 and then the Lions 4 at the tight end spot. Moving on to the offensive line, I do think that the Lions have the number 1 offensive line in the division. I think it's one of the best in the league. You've got Taylor Decker and Penei Sewell on the bookends. Frank Ragnow might be the best center in football, or is at least a top 5 center there. You've got some good guards as well. Jonah Jackson was a Pro Bowler just a few years ago. So I definitely think overall the Lions are the number 1 offensive line. Moving on, I think the Packers are next. David Bakhtiari, when healthy, is very, very good. He hasn't been healthy much at all, but even beyond that, you've got Elton Jenkins. Josh Myers is not amazing, but he's a solid player. You've got Zach Tom, who I thought played really, really well last year as well. So I actually think the Packers do have some solid upside on the offensive line. It's not 100% proven, but I do like what they have. And then moving forward, I've got the Vikings. I think the Vikings have an underrated offensive line. Brian O'Neill, Christian Darrisaw. Darrisaw is one of the best tackles in the NFL. I think he's incredibly underrated. The interior is a little bit squishy. Ed Ingram and some of those other guys didn't have the best seasons last year, but I do think overall they do have a solid offensive line. And moving on to the Bears, there's just still a lot of uncertainty there. You draft Darnell Wright. I think he's a solid plug-and-play right tackle. You bring in Nate Davis to play guard as well. I do think that overall they could be a cohesive unit and get a lot better. It's really only one way to go. They were terrible last year, but I do think Braxton Jones, Tevin Jenkins, some of these guys are still very young, very much developing, and so they are going to go in that fourth spot for now. At the edge position, the Packers are going to be number 1. You've got Rashawn Gary, who I think is perennially underrated. He's one of the better edges in the league, just insane physical freak. Definitely somebody that I think is very, very good. You've also got Preston Smith, who is showing his age a little bit, but he's still decent. You've got Lucas Van Ness, who you drafted. Just think the Packers have a very solid edge room. Moving on, you have the Lions number 2. You've got Aiden Hutchinson, James Houston. You got some interesting pieces there. I do think that they're ascending and getting better. You like what they have. They've got some decent depth there at that edge position as well. Next, you've got the Vikings. Danielle Hunter is the headliner here. I don't think you've got a ton outside of Danielle Hunter, but he's able to stay healthy. He is definitely one of the better edges in the league as well. So there is a debate that they could potentially be at that number 2 spot. They've got the proven star, while the Lions maybe just have a little bit more ascending talent, but I think overall they are relatively interchangeable there. And then the Bears clearly at number 4 for me. You bring in DeMarcus Walker from Tennessee. You've got Travis Gibson still. You've got some interesting pieces. Dominique Robinson as well, who you drafted from Miami. Their leading sack getter in 2022 was Jaquan Brisker, their safety. They just need to get some more pass rush production out of these guys. I think ultimately it is a better unit than it was last year, but still a lot of problems for that Bears defensive front. Moving to the interior defensive line, I've got the Packers at number 1. You've got Kenny Clark, who is one of the better nose tackles in the league. You've got Devontae Wyatt, TJ Slayton, Carl Brooks, who they drafted from Bowling Green, I think is an intriguing piece as well. So I do like what the Packers have. I think they've got some good potential there to be a really solid unit. Moving on to the Vikings next. I don't love the Vikings interior defensive line either, but this is a fairly weak division when it comes to this spot. I do think that Harrison Phillips, Dean Lowry, Jaquelin Roy, Kyraisis Tonga. This is a decent group. It's absolutely nothing that you're very scared of, but I do think that you've got some nice pieces there, some established starters, especially with Lowry, Harrison Phillips, Tonga. They're all decent players. It's more kind of about the number of quality players than the actual stars on this team. Next, you've got the Lions. Aleem McNeil, I think, is a very underrated player. He made me think to potentially put the Lions at number 2, but there's just nothing else behind him. You've got Isaiah Buggs, you've got Broderick Martin, who you drafted high, Levi Onwuzurike, who has really just not turned into the player the Lions hoped. I just don't think there's much behind Aleem McNeil. They're one injury away from being potentially the worst interior defensive line in the league. And then you've got the Bears at number 4. There's just so much unproven here. Andrew Billings is your nose tackle. You've got Justin Jones, who I think is a decent player, but I do think that he is a little bit streaky. He's kind of that boomer bust type of defensive tackle. He's a good penetrator, but when he's not really making a splash play in the backfield, he's not going to be a dominant player. You drafted 2 interesting kind of raw pieces at the end of round 2, early round 3 in Gervin Dexter and Zach Pickens. Maybe those guys can turn it into something. I definitely think they've got all the potential to, but I do think that there are just kind of some things that they're going to have to go through to really kind of become a quality starting piece in the NFL. And the Bears just don't have much at all in front of them, so they are going to be at number 4 for the interior defensive line. Moving to linebacker, the Bears are going to be first here. They've invested heavily in the linebacker position this offseason. You bring in Tremaine Edmonds from Buffalo. I definitely think he is going to be a very big piece for them. You get TJ Edwards from Philadelphia as well. This is kind of a completely new unit for the Bears. After trading Roquan Smith, a lot of people didn't think they valued this linebacker position, but they've invested a lot into it this offseason. You bring in Jack Sanborn last year as an undrafted free agent who played fairly well as well. So I definitely think the Bears have a very solid linebacker room. Next, we've got the Green Bay Packers. Devondre Campbell is a very, very good player. Was one of the best linebackers in the league just 2 years ago. Wasn't quite as good last year, but I do think he's still a quality player. You've got Quay Walker as well. Definitely hasn't lived up to his billing as a first-round pick. Going into year 2, he still has time to change that. I do think that was a terrible pick, but overall, they've got the athleticism. They've got the proven guy as well at the linebacker spot. At number 3, you've got the Lions. I absolutely love Jack Campbell. I did think he was a first-round caliber player. I do think the Lions didn't necessarily attack positional value very well, but I had no problem with the talent of Jack Campbell going in the first round. Behind him, you've got Alex Anzalone, you've got Malcolm Rodriguez. Derek Barnes has been an intriguing player for a while as well. If Campbell really hits the ground running, I totally think you can make a case to have them over the Packers if Quay Walker really isn't able to figure things out. But I think the Lions do have some interesting, intriguing linebackers that Jack Campbell especially I think could be a Pro Bowler for a very long time. And then you've got the Vikings at number 4. You move on from Eric Kendricks, kind of ushering in a new era at linebacker. You have Brian Asamoah, who was out of Oklahoma a few years ago. Didn't love him coming out of the draft. Jordan Hicks was a decent player in Arizona, but absolutely nothing super special. You've got Troy Dye, Troy Reeder as well. Ivan Pace is somebody that I think is very interesting as a blitzing linebacker. He was an undrafted free agent, so maybe he can play a role and kind of raise this team up a little bit, but I think overall they just don't have the strongest group of linebackers after moving on from Eric Kendricks. That brings us to the corner room where I have the Packers at number 1. I think Jair Alexander is a top 5 corner in the league. He is just so good, and I think a lot of people kind of forget how talented he is. You've also got Eric Stokes, who had a really solid rookie year. He was a little bit worse last year, but I think overall still showed some nice things. Rasul Douglas has been a very good player for him as well, so Packers have a solid cornerback room, absolutely. Number 2, I think I am going to go with the Lions here. Kind of hard to classify what Chauncey Gardner-Johnson is, but really good nickel corner. You also bring in Sutton from Pittsburgh as well. I think that was a great signing. You also bring in Emmanuel Mosley from the 49ers. He was really good before he got injured last year. This could be a very solid unit. You move on from Jeff Okudah, kind of finally burning that bridge, taking the loss on that pick. But I think the Lions have a very solid trio of starting corners, and this could be a very good group going into next year. At number 3, you've got the Bears, kind of redone their secondary pretty well. You've got Jalen Johnson, who is a solid corner. He's maybe not a dominant corner 1, but I think he's a solid player. Kindle Vildor played decent last year. He's probably going to be more of a rotational role as Tyreek Stevenson comes in, the pick out of Miami in the second round. I think he could be an interesting player. And then their second round pick last year, Kyler Gordon, has played fairly decently in the slot. He wasn't very good early to start the year, but I think he progressed a lot as the year went on. I think there's still some uncertainty here. I don't think there's any superstars, but I do think that it's a pretty solid unit for the Bears. And then at number 4, you've got the Minnesota Vikings. Andrew Booth was one of the guys I loved coming out last year, but he's dealt with injuries a lot. I think Brian Flores, he's his kind of player, but I think that Booth has got to stay healthy, but he does have the talent to be successful. Besides him, you've got Byron Murphy, who I thought was a very good signing out of Arizona. I think that, those two could potentially be decent. Caleb Evans wasn't great last year, but potentially he could bounce back. Mekhi Blackman you drafted as well this year. So there's some nice young talent to work with for Brian Flores. It's just going to be about getting the most out of them, really kind of putting things together. Just a lot of unproven commodities in that back end for the Vikings. And then finally at safety, this was a very difficult position for me to rank. I do think the Bears have the best safety room. Eddie Jackson, Jaquan Brisker both have been really good. I thought Brisker was a great rookie safety, did a lot of really good things, kind of a do-it-all player, can get some interceptions, some sacks, pressures. I think that overall he's a very solid player, very young and ascending. Eddie Jackson coming off a Liz Frank injury. Is he going to be able to recover from that? We'll see. But last year he was having his best season since 2018, and I think it's been a very good player for them on that back end when he has some talent around him. At number 2, I am going to go with the Lions. Kirby Joseph was one of my draft crushes last year, and he looked awesome last year. I think that he is definitely an ascending player and somebody that I really like for him. Chauncey Gardner-Johnson potentially would be considered a safety. He's kind of that hybrid player. Didn't really consider him one here. Anthony Walker's a solid second safety, and I think that this is a pretty good duo there. At number 3, I'm going to go with the Vikings. Harrison Smith is getting old. He's absolutely not the same player that he was. Lewis Seen got injured in the first game last year, really wasn't able to show what he could do. Wasn't the highest on him coming out, but I think that's a decent duo. Harrison Smith He's not getting any younger, not getting any better necessarily, but I still think he's a good player. And then the Packers, I just am not very impressed with what they have on the back end. Jonathan Owens slated to potentially be a starter. You lose Adrian Amos, who was pretty bad last year, but Darnell Savage hasn't been that same player that a lot of people thought he would turn into as a young safety. I just think that they've got a little bit of uncertainty there on that back end. They absolutely should have addressed it, I think, a little bit more. Let me know what you think of my rankings down below. If you like this kind of content, please hit that like button and subscribe button down below. Would truly appreciate any support. Let me know what division you want to see next, and I will catch you in the next one.